Have you ever wondered why your prescription drugs cost so much? I mean, why is it that medicines that typically can be made for, say, 5 cents or 10 cents or even 50 cents are sold to you at the pharmacy for $15? Where does that money go?
I'm Essen Zafar, and welcome to another episode of UnfairNation, the podcast that discusses our nation's rising inequity and social, political, and economic inequality, what it means for you, and what you can do about it. Every other week, we interview one person to get their perspective on structural inequality, and today I'm joined by Merith Basey, a lawyer and advocate in Washington, D.C. Waiting for that one miracle vaccine to be developed so that we can go back to work and so that no more lives have to be lost to COVID. But our guest today explains why the pharmaceutical industry has deeper, older, and broader problems, which will affect who ends up getting a COVID vaccine when it comes out and how expensive it will be when it comes out. Her name's Merith Basey. She's a lawyer and an advocate, and she's also the executive director of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is an organization that encourages institutions of higher education to make publicly funded medicine more affordable. She's got some crazy facts about the pharmaceutical industry that will blow your minds, and a hopeful vision for how we can fix the industry through direct involvement by the public. That means you. So let's listen. All right, so your bio will have been done, okay?
Okay.
I've told everybody already about your mask-wearing escapades, and they'll know that you go on to the National Mall with a mask and signs and pictures of pills, which either makes you sound a little crazy or very effective, one or the other.
Or a superhero. When
you
you say escapades, it makes me sound like, I was like, that sounds more like a cartoon. But I'll take it.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, joining me on the podcast
course.
on Memorial Day.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like we're going anywhere. But,
that is exactly right. Not anywhere fast, anyway.
But I certainly do appreciate, nonetheless, that you took some time out of your holiday to join me. And you're in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes, physically here. Yeah, calling in from my apartment, but I'm originally from the UK.
Oh, I couldn't tell. I would never be able to pick that up. You know, I went to a British prep school, so.
Oh, okay.
But I've lost my accent.
I was going to say, dare I ask which one?
Yeah, I've lost my accent. Oh, it was overseas. It was
okay.
Middle East, yeah.
Okay,
we
nice.
learned time by saying 10:30. Yeah.
10:30, exactly.
Yeah. Instead of
as it should be.
10:30. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had uniforms and cardigans and the whole bit.
Did you have any hats, boaters, or anything?
I think
of the
we had
sort?
hats. Yeah, we had hats, and we did plays, and it was very cultural.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we had caps. The boys had caps in prep school, and we had boaters in the summer. But that seems like a very long time ago now. And my accent is not as strong as it used to be.
Oh, it's gotten a little bit weaker here in the U.S.
Yeah, I spent a long time in a few places, including the U.S. And I think it's normally people think I'm Australian, which I find
interesting.
Amusing. Yeah.
Well, I think they just don't know the difference. Neither do I, really, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to have you and your accent. I think your accent's going to do wonders for the listenership of this podcast. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you.
So you work on reforming the way we purchase and the way we use, and perhaps the way that prescription medications are made and marketed inside the U.S. Am I correct in summarizing your work? And if not, can you add more?
Yes. I mean, we are pushing for a non-profit system or a biomedical R&D system, or the way we make medicines, that is not focused on prioritizing profit, but is focused on people's needs first, health needs worldwide. And not just in the US, because the US, while it's, NIH is the largest funder of global health research in the world.
And what's that stand for?
The National Institutes of Health, yes, here in Bethesda in Washington. But there are many similar entities around the world who are also driving publicly funded research. Like in Canada, that's the Centre for CIHR, the Canadian Institute of Health Research.
And when you say we, you're referring to your organization, right? Not just to yourself.
So we, in the broad sense that we fund, it would be the public that funds biomedical research. But we in UAM, at Universities Allied for Essential Medicine, is, yes, it's a collective we who is driving campaigns at universities in over 20 different countries around the world.
And what's the campaigns? What are they for? What's the problem you're trying to solve?
So the way we make medicines today, especially people are probably noticing this now more than ever, given COVID-19, is failing people. It's prioritizing shareholder profit. So this is why we're seeing high drug prices, drug prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, let alone massive price increases, over the last decade, like with insulin, a 300% increase in a drug that was actually initially developed in 1922. So nearly 100 years later, it's being priced out of reach, even though the drugs are off patent. The fact that 1 in 3 people in this country cannot afford to pay their prescription drugs. This is a crisis. It's similar figures in different countries around the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 1 in 2. People don't have regular access to medicines.
And this is contrary to the pattern where, the longer things exist in the marketplace, the cheaper they get, right?
I mean, in a free market, that's what you would anticipate. But what you're seeing, say, with insulin, there are 3 primary corporations, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk, who control over 90% of the volume of sales worldwide. And as a result, you see the prices in this country, in the US, increasing in lockstep, which is it's anti-competitive behavior, which shouldn't, technically it's not legal, but we haven't seen that shift dramatically. And that's particularly unique to America.
Why do you think that is unique to America?
It goes to the core of the challenge, I think, in this country, which is that the system that has been set up here, it really, it doesn't come from this understanding that health is a human right, and so it's very much for profit, a for-profit system, and so currently Medicare cannot negotiate drug prices. So given that Medicare is also the largest purchaser of drugs in this country, there is a huge problem there. But that's particularly specific to the United States. Many other countries have what you would call like socialized medical care, or in the UK we have the National Health System, for example. So which differs in the way that you can enter the system. You're only paying through your taxpayer funds.
And medications in those countries is
subsidized. Yeah, also because it's subsidized because the governments work differently and they negotiate with big pharma in a different way. In this country, I was just going to say that you have about 2 lobbyists per congressperson on Capitol Hill
for pharma only.
Big pharma, for big pharma, exactly. So to really tackle this, You really have to get to these core pieces. But that is where sort of the organization that I run, Universities Allied for Essential Medicine, comes in, because actually most of the R&D is funded by the public, even though this might not appear to be the case for what you read in the press. So $40 billion of public funds goes from the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, as I mentioned, to about 2,500 universities, medical schools in every single state and in many different countries around the world to fund basic research and also clinical trials into new medicines. And they tend to fund the riskiest research. And it's only when further down the line you have a promising compound or innovation that big pharma enters the arena, if you like. So it gets patented by a university and licensed to a pharmaceutical corporation, who may then take it through further trials.
The university makes money, presumably, right, when it does this?
Yeah, the university, since in 1980, there was a change in the law. There's the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed universities to profit from their innovations. Prior to that, that was not the case. And now the problem is you're seeing these patents as a proxy for innovation.
What does that mean? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so if you're competing just by the number of patents, so if you want, Harvard versus Yale or UCLA, if you're just looking at patents, you're just counting the number of patents that are given to a product. It doesn't actually account for impact, right? So you're not, say this was just for medicine, for example, it doesn't actually translate into whether or not that new medicine is saving lives. And sort of whether or not it's on the market is not necessarily the same as people being able to have access or afford it, right? So there's that piece. I was just going to say universities play a critical role in that drug pipeline because they are really the innovators. It is not these big pharmaceutical corporations who are driving the most innovative research, like things like vaccines, like right now with COVID-19 or therapeutics diagnostics. Most of them are starting life with public money in a university lab. And to give you an example, like the last 210 drugs that were approved by the FDA in this country, all of them have basic research linked to the National Institutes of Health. That means funded by the taxpayer.
So these universities are being paid to conduct research on kind of specific or maybe broad problems, right, in science. Mm-hmm. And then the solution that arises out of this research may be a medication.
Yes.
And then that medication or that formula for that medication is licensed to a pharmaceutical company like Amgen or Gilead mm-hmm. or something like that. And then those companies sell. And so your ask, basically, the piece of your advocacy is, hey, listen, you're charging an exorbitant amount for these medications that were subsidized in effect by the U.S. taxpayer, and that you should give some of that money back and make the medications more affordable because they've been subsidized. You're kind of you're charging money on the backs of the U.S. taxpayer. Is that the basic argument?
I think that's the basic argument, exactly. But it's more about it's not about not making a profit. It's about not making an excessive profit or profiteering from heavily subsidized life-saving medicines. This is not an iPhone. So anyone can live without an iPhone. We live without iPhones for centuries. This is the difference between life and death, and this is something that we have already paid for in the first place.
What's the gap like what's that profit gap like? Can you give me some numbers to show, are they charging 50x more than what it would cost?
The next country, yeah. So in this country, we pay we're the sort of pay the most for our drugs than any other country in the world. Switzerland and Canada come next, and generally the drugs are at least 40% higher than in Canada. So, for example, there's a publicly funded drug. It came out of money from the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health, developed at your alma mater, I understand, at UCLA.
Yeah, go Bruins. Well, I don't know if go Bruins after we're done with this conversation.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. This drug is very promising cancer drug for late-stage prostate cancer called Xtandi. And it's being sold now back to the American taxpayer or people who pay taxes in this country at $129,000 for a treatment. The same drug, wow. The same company is, they are being charged in Canada about $29,000, and they're still making a profit on that, right? So a lot of the research was funded here, and yet other countries, because the way their governments negotiate with big pharma, their systems, they are not being price gouged at the same level. We also know that drug only costs a few dollars really to make, and so there's no reason for it to be $29,000 either. And you see this again and again. You mentioned Gilead. There was they became quite well known because of this $84,000 treatment for hepatitis C. It was actually started life at Emory University, and it became the $1,000 pill.
So what's the rationale that these drug makers use to say, hey, listen, we're charging $100,000 more here in the U.S., whereas they can charge $29,000? I mean, you said that some of these countries are subsidizing it. So does that mean that they're paying $100,000 for the pill and then the consumer is only paying $29,000 in Canada?
No, not exactly. I mean, the government will be paying something, but the difference is, say, like in the UK, we have the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which is nice, and they
indeed it is.
It is very nice. They negotiate with pharmaceutical corporations, and there is a level to which the British government will say, we are only willing to pay up to this amount for this drug, and they have the ways that they work that out. And so that doesn't happen in a country like the US. So you say, yeah, there's no caps. There's a lot of work and organizations that are pushing for these changes, of course. But the challenge is, I think, the company, the companies are massively profitable. They have a lot of power, to influence the government or the administration, I should say here. And it's what they price these drugs at what the market will bear, basically. I don't know if you remember was it a couple of years ago now, famously a chap called Martin Shkreli was known as Pharma Bro. He was in the papers because he raised the price of a drug called Daraprim from $12.50 to $750 overnight. And when he was asked, why did you do this? This is immoral. This was a drug to treat opportunistic infections, often for people living with HIV, for example. He said, well, because I could. And it's legal to do that, right? So this is not an illegal practice. Whether it's moral or not, or unethical, is for you to decide. And he was interviewed, and he became the sort of face in some ways of Big Pharma. But for in the movement that we're part of at UAM, it served as this figure to highlight what is actually happening with a lot of these corporations, because there are no checks and balances in the way that we would like to see them.
So let me challenge you a little bit on that, right? So with corporations, the capitalist model, basically says, look, I can charge whatever I want for my products, and if the price I charge is too expensive, nobody will buy it, and I'll lower my price, right? I mean, whatever the market kind of can demand or bear. What the market can bear essentially is capitalism, right? I mean, technically speaking, in its rawest sense. So shouldn't the advocacy efforts that you are talking about be aimed at a subsidizing authority or a regulatory authority like a state government or a federal government?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. So first of all, it's recognizing that the massive investment that the public has already put into these drugs, right? So if you were a private investor, you would expect a return on that investment, wouldn't you? Especially if you'd already put in $10 million to a product.
Right.
As the public, we are not getting that return on our investment by having lower priced drugs. As a result, we're paying again through our insurance, and then we're paying again at the pharmacy. So that money that is accounted for, that $40 billion in the US alone, is not included or considered when it comes to pricing those drugs, right? And to know that this is not just them making a profit. This is, between 2000 and 2018, I think it was, so over 18 years, the 35 biggest drug companies, their combined revenue was $11.5 trillion. $11.5 trillion. And the profit, their sort of gross profit in that was $8.6 trillion.
Wow.
And their median net income was twice as high in those 35 corporations compared to the next 357 companies. Right. So that includes oil, that includes Google, that includes, Facebook. These are not small corporations who are struggling, Right. So just to give you some perspective on what this means, and also recognizing that, again, this is being driven, the innovation is being driven by these our taxpayer dollars. And this is something that I think, is actually pretty bipartisan. People think that wherever you sit on, that if you're investing public money, there should be a return on that investment for the public.
Right. So my question was, why shouldn't that ask be made of the government to say, hey, listen, you've invested our public money in these corporations. They're not, charging an appropriate amount for this medication and profiting enormously on it, and that they need to be regulated. If they wish to receive public funds, they must be regulated. They must set price caps, for instance.
They should be, and there is sort of legislation and all sorts of efforts for that to happen. But when you have the head of HHS, of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, who was a former pharmaceutical CEO of Eli Lilly, of one of those three pharmaceutical giants that I mentioned that produce insulin, it's the fox guarding the hen house. Like how could you imagine that said individual will be protecting people's lives over profits just based on the experiences that he has had and the experience that we know that he oversaw that 300% increase in insulin over 10 years in this country. So, there are a lot of systemic challenges, which is why also I think pushing for a publicly funded, democratized R&D system could also be a key part of the solution. And I think what we're seeing now with COVID, if we're thinking into the future, is this understanding increasingly, I think, across labs worldwide, because this is such a global issue, it should be a global shared responsibility in terms of the response. We want to know what is happening in a lab in Germany as much as we want to know what's happening in a lab in China or in the US, because we don't know where that vaccine is going to appear or the sort of the closest thing to it. And so having this open and more of an open, collaborative, needs-driven approach, it's obviously that's evidence-based and transparent, is going to be is part of what the push now, I think, for the future needs to be. And going back to the university piece, for us, this is a critical point of inflection or pressure, because if you're able to change the way that universities and publicly funded research institutions patent and license their innovations before they get into the hands of large corporations who have different incentives, then we have an opportunity, without having to wait for legislation, to change the system and hold universities accountable to their missions. Like UCLA's, like part of their mission as a research university, sort of this lofty goal is the creation, dissemination, preservation, and application of knowledge for the betterment of our global society.
Oh, what a mission statement.
It's impressive. But if they're not making sure that the innovations on their campus or across the UC system are accessible, affordable, how can they possibly live up to that?
And so that's why your organization has that moniker and is focused on universities, right? Your way into this problem is to say, the target you've, I guess, primarily chosen is to influence all of those public research dollars coming into universities and to say, hey, we'd like to encourage you to spend these research dollars in a more responsible way?
Absolutely, yes. And just last week, we released this new site as well, so folks can look for themselves and check the dollars that are going into their universities. We looked at 60 universities in the US and a number of universities in 13 different countries at publicmedsforcovid.org, just to sort of track the millions, if not billions of dollars already invested to develop new therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19. So you can see where that work is taking place. And it's an opportunity for leverage. And actually, we're pushing a lot of those institutions to sign on to something called the Open COVID Pledge, which is pledging for the duration of the pandemic of COVID-19 to basically make their IP open, so it won't be a barrier to access as we go forward. Even, some of these giant corporations like Facebook, IBM have been signing on to this. And while they're not doing, say, vaccine research, they may be developing a technology or it could be tracking tool for tracking contacts and tracing them that we might need in the future, because we know this pandemic will continue, to ensure that this is something that can be more easily shared with the world.
So let's talk a little bit more about universities, right? So like you said, your one of your targets is kind of universities and how they spend research dollars. That's kind of your way into the advocacy for a more responsible pharmaceutical industry. Fantastic. What about the argument that if I'm a public university, let's say UCLA, my funding is declining, especially now with COVID. I'm losing money from all sources. And this remains one of the few ways that as a public institution of higher learning, I can actually make some money. And I use that money to support research and employ students and et cetera, et cetera. If the prices for drugs go down, right? So if I'm now charging $29,000 instead of $100,000, the argument that pharmaceutical company would make is, presuming that, we're going to just pay a lot less in licensing fees back to UCLA. They'll make a lot less money. They have less incentive to do research. They have less incentive to use research dollars. Does that argument hold any traction? I mean, basically saying that reforming the pharmaceutical industry results in a decline in the revenue for public universities.
I would disagree with that. So socially responsible licensing, or we call at UAM, we call this global access licensing. This has meant when a university, say, patents a drug, they will license it with a non-exclusive license. So that means that if a corporation wants to develop a drug, they can go ahead and develop it, but it doesn't prevent a second or third or fourth or fifth company, especially a generic, from also choosing to develop that drug, right? So to give an example, actually how the organization was founded. In 2001, it was the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. There was a drug that had been developed at Yale University with public funds. And it was being sold at a price that was high in the US, but even higher relatively for South Africa, where the burden of disease was. And South Africa's government were looking to develop, to treat people living with HIV in conjunction with Doctors Without Borders for the first time. And but they realized that the price that was set, they were never going to be able to carry out the program that they wanted. And they realized that this drug developed at Yale, it was obviously part of the problem. And some young HIV/AIDS activists who were starting at the university organized because they didn't want their university to be complicit in the deaths of thousands of South Africans. And so what they did was they lobbied their administration and they persuaded their university to change the license from an exclusive license with Bristol Myers Squibb, which was the corporation that was developing this drug in the United States, to a non-exclusive license, which meant that a generic company in India who had already been making the drug were able to legally then sell it to the government of South Africa outside India. And it meant that Doctors Without Borders were able to treat people living with HIV for the first time, and it led to a 90% reduction in the price of that drug. Wow. So massive shift, right? So we know that when there's competition, as you sort of mentioned free markets earlier, when there is competition, drug prices obviously will get reduced. And the more competition, the lower the drug price. So socially responsible licensing or global access licensing encourages sort of non-exclusive licensing in that way.
Could it also mean like a price cap in the licensing agreement, mandating a price cap?
Each license will be different. These are sort of principles, right? So like it will depend on that agreement. So it really depends. And historically, this focus and like that story or the founding story was about access in a lower income country, right? From a drug that was developed in the United States in this case. We have shown, and there's evidence and peer-reviewed articles that shows that with that particular case, the university didn't actually lose any money as a result, right? So, because they weren't actually selling any product in that part of the world anyway. So you're actually introducing a market, you could argue, as well. So back to your point of UCLA or other publicly funded universities losing money, it's also part of a bigger system, because if they're also supporting paying healthcare for their employees and paying for drugs, like that you're ending up paying for it anyway. Right. So, if you're not paying for it up front, you'll pay for it somewhere else.
UCLA specifically, because they run a very large hospital network, right? So then they're paying for a high price to purchase those medicines. Although they would argue that their insured patients or Medicare and Medi-Cal patients are then subsidizing the cost, so UCLA gets off scot-free.
But Medicare, a third of those, as the biggest purchaser of those drugs, someone is paying, and the people who end up paying is the public in different degrees, multiple times.
Which means then less tax revenue for the UC system. I see how this works.
So it's unfortunately it's all connected, and simply we've already paid for it.
So the way I'm understanding it is, like, if I were to compare it to Great Britain, right, which is the example that you used, right? So in Great Britain, the government steps in, they subsidize the cost of medications, and they do so through their kind of economic power, right? Their purchasing power. In the U.S., the government steps out. Instead of doing a subsidizing of medicines, they just give $40 billion. Instead of using that $40 billion to subsidize the purchase of medication, they just give a lot of that to research, which in a roundabout way ends up subsidizing pharmaceutical companies. And so some of the work, it seems like to me, that you're trying to do is to, kind of go around that weird, it's like 2 or 3 steps removed from direct government subsidization, and you're saying, hey, listen, just let's close the gap.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and don't forget, the UK is still funding research as well, right? So It's not that it's an either-or situation.
True. Right.
The piece that I think is important to understand, like if we're talking about inequality as well in this country, this system is driving inequality.
Tell me more about that.
If you think about these increase in the price of drugs right now, and the fact that 1 in 3 people in this country can't afford their prescription drugs, and that was pre-COVID, and you think of the huge numbers, the millions of people who now have no health insurance and have no jobs and no support. The mind boggles, and it's terrifying to think how many people now are excluded from that system. And then if you're offered, you do have the privilege of getting to see a caregiver, provider, and then you're offered a drug at a price that you can't afford. What options do you have? Do you then decide between the mortgage and your health? Do you decide, between food? And these are the shocking decisions that people are having to make. If you need insulin, paying a couple $100 per month just to survive is unacceptable, and it's immoral when you know that drug was developed over 100 years ago, or a version of it, with taxpayer money on a university campus in Canada.
So if we take regulation out of the situation, right, if let's say we make this argument about broader inequality, is that an incentive for pharmaceutical companies minus regulation to lower their drug prices? Or put another way, what is the business incentive for a pharmaceutical company to make drug prices cheaper or more affordable, rather?
That you've hit the nail on the head, as it were.
This is what we're trying to do here.
There is no incentive currently, because
terrifying.
Yes, and it is legal, but it's because
wait, what is legal?
They're allowed. Legally, they're not breaking the law by having these high drug prices, because they are accountable to their shareholders. That is, whatever pharmaceutical video you see or ad, just take a step back and think about who are they accountable to, and it is not to the people. And this is where the challenge lies. And I think
usually when I'm seeing those ads, all I'm thinking about is the insane side effects, like death. Side effect.
Yeah, and you're just like, 2 things to think about when you see those ads. 2 high-income countries allow direct-to-consumer marketing: the United States and New Zealand, interestingly enough.
Where you're from.
Yeah, that other place that I'm from. Exactly. These 2 nations are allowing pharmaceutical corporations to advertise, including obviously the small print that you mentioned, like including death. But you have to question why, if I need insulin, I don't need an advert telling me that I need insulin. If you have cancer, you do not need some television ad telling you that you need a specific drug. And going back to, the high drug prices piece, we know that pharmaceutical corporations spend at least 2 to 4 times on sales and marketing than they do on R&D, right? So into that new research. So these are all areas, like think of the amount of money that goes into those ads that you see. And they're very convincing, but they are not the full picture. And in reality, these new innovations, the ones that really are life-saving, thinking about COVID right now is the prime example. Who is driving that research? When you see a headline, like recently there was something that said J&J non-profit vaccine, something or other. And it sounds great. You think non-profit vaccine sounds great. But then if you actually dig in, you realize that, first of all, the public has already invested $500 million into this product, which is still a very long way from being delivered, of course. And 2, they said not for profit, they were going to be sold at $10 per vaccine, which if you do the calculations, that's going to come to about a $10 billion profit from a pandemic.
Quite a nonprofit, huh?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I don't know what you consider nonprofit, but certainly not that. When you think of the scale of this issue and the challenge that we face right now, and we're pushing at UAM in partnership with another organization called the Center for Artistic Activism for a campaign. We're calling it Free the Vaccine for COVID-19. And what we are pushing for is a publicly funded diagnostics, therapeutics and the eventual vaccine to be sustainably priced, available to all and free at the point of delivery. And what we mean by sustainably priced means that governments are not being price gouged. Like, we know that we're already paying for it, so it's not technically free, right? There's that piece. It should be free at the point of delivery. There shouldn't be a copay anywhere in the world if there's not going to be barriers to access for people. And the other piece, available to all, regardless of insurance status or regardless of immigration status. If we want a vaccine to work appropriately, we're going to need to vaccinate as many people as possible so that we can eventually achieve herd immunity. And that won't happen if large chunks of the population worldwide are excluded.
So I have a question for you. Some of the problems you've outlined make it, seem like, well, let me put this another way. Is a long-term solution to some of these problems to privatize the research and production and dissemination of pharmaceuticals, just like we do it with healthcare? In Great Britain, we have a healthcare system that's rather not privatized. Sorry, what's the word I'm looking for?
I would go with democratize.
What's the opposite? Well, so in Great Britain, we have a public health system that is in government hands, right?
Yeah, a national healthcare system. Nationalized.
So should we have that's the word. So should we then nationalize the pharmaceutical companies and have the production, distribution of pharmaceuticals and medications be in government hands?
Yes, I think so. And I think there is a lot of evidence.
That's your new mission. You're welcome.
There's a
so
lot.
Easy.
That's so easy. Yeah, sure. There are other groups who are pushing for these ideas. A publicly funded, democratized R&D system, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this would be a critical part of the solution. And we at UAM also believe that the R&D system, there are alternatives. It doesn't mean blow up, big pharma tomorrow. We need them to make medicines, but they don't need to do it at the extortionate price. Yeah,
maybe a hybrid system.
They're doing it, and having competition. And I think there's proposals to, for the most critical, essential medicines to be developed entirely by with public funds and manufactured, of course. And I think that would be a key. Obviously, we need legislation, nationwide healthcare plan like Medicare for all. would also play a key role, because it would save, Public Citizen estimated that they would save about $500 billion just on administration. And even the Koch brothers, brothers found that it would save money, which is, those are strange bedfellows.
Yeah, I mean, like a system like not exactly like the system, but a system like the post office, right, where you have a delivery system that is in quasi-government hands because it does things and it reaches people that a profit incentive can't reach. And then you have UPS and FedEx for those times where you need to have a profitized or privatized system, reach these, places where post office is not as efficient, but you have both.
Exactly. And you have the option. I think, I think there's a lot of different arguments, but ultimately these shifts, there are, for example, there's an organization called the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, and this is something we haven't touched on yet, but how the current system fails is because we don't focus on diseases of the poor historically. The current system focuses on drugs that will make a profit or people that can afford to buy them, right? So the current system is failing in the sense that 1 in 6 people globally live with a neglected disease, and yet from the research we've done at UAM, you see that universities, about less than 3% of their research dollars go to research neglected tropical diseases. And this group, DNDi, their history, they come out of Doctors Without Borders, because Doctors Without Borders realized in the field that there weren't even drugs for the diseases that they were trying to treat their patients with. And so they were like...
And that's because there's no incentive for these companies to develop these drugs, right?
Because of the system, exactly, because it's set up putting profit at the center rather than people and needs, we're seeing these failures. And so the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, what they can bring a product to market, they estimate for around $110 million, which is not nothing, but compared to the estimates that Big Pharma will suggest in the billions, which is including their prices for sales and marketing and all these things, is significantly different. And they've been able to, like most recently, they were able to bring forward one of the first treatments for sleeping sickness, which would never have been researched or developed had they not prioritized that need. So what my point is that there are these different mechanisms that are being encouraged and promoted, and universities can also play a key role in being the drivers of these alternative mechanisms.
What about students? Can they get involved?
Yes. So all of our work is actually driven by students. So while we have students in 20 different countries around the world, our campaigns are entirely driven by students. We have a small staff in Brazil, Berlin, and Washington, D.C. And the way that we organize is students organize on their campuses to push university administrations to engage on this issue and hold them accountable.
And so do you have chapters all over different campuses?
Yes. So across North America, we have chapters at over 50 different research institutions. And
do you think COVID-19 is an opportunity to change some of the problems you've outlined around affordable medications?
Yes, 100%. And I think it is the moment. I think we cannot go back. I think in this country, if people cannot recognize now the need for a system that puts people first, I can't imagine that they ever will. And I think the fact that we are all struggling for a solution, and that probably until a vaccine arrives, the return to, I don't think there will be a return to normal life, but I do think it is now more clear than ever that we need a global solution, that it should be this shared responsibility, that we need to be pushing for these new models so that we are preventing this happening again. Because I think it's all very well to clap for our health workers, but if we really want to honor those essential workers, I think what we need to do is promise them that we're not going to put them in this situation in the future. And that is the people, the 100,000 people in this country alone who've lost their lives. The only solution is to commit to something better, and something better are these new alternatives that are implementable. We're not imagining something that is impossible. This is something that is here. We just need to push for these open, collaborative, needs-driven solutions, so that we don't find ourselves in this situation in another 5 years' time.
So how does somebody get involved in working on some of these issues if they're listening today and right now? What can they do? They can get involved, I presume, with your organization. If they're a student, they can join the chapter. What else can they do?
Yeah. So we have obviously student chapters. If you're faculty, we started with lawyers. We have a lot of lawyers and
big mistake.
Public health. But really, any student or faculty person who feels moved to do something, we would love to hear from you, because we would love to see more and more universities signing on to the Open COVID Pledge now during this pandemic, and seeing this as a ladder of engagement really for universities to start by signing on to this, and then beginning these other conversations around all essential medicines, not just those for COVID. So students, faculty, obviously you can go to our website, uam.org, to donate, but also the Free the Vaccine campaign, it's freethevaccine.org. There's a Take Action page there where you can take action depending on how many minutes you have, whether you want to sign on to something, you want to support. Yeah. So that should be updated. You can sign up for instant updates. We're doing a lot of creative things right now to engage researchers and faculty to think about these issues. And, this work is also aligned with, there was a letter that some people might have seen that Oxfam and UNAIDS delivered a week or two ago, and it had 140 world leaders or former world leaders signing on to this letter. And the goals are very much aligned with our Free the Vaccine campaign that I mentioned earlier, about a vaccine being sustainably priced, available to all, and free at the point of delivery. So we're all engaged and pushing for these solutions. And I think the more people who begin to understand that another way is possible, and would like to support a solution and take some agency, or have some agency at a time where I feel like there's a lot of people who are, at home, anxious, not sure how to connect, and feeling very isolated. I think we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, awesome. We'll link to your site in our show notes, and also to some of the resources you've shared. Hey, listen, thanks for joining us for this last hour on the podcast. This was fantastic. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. I'm sure we could go for another 2 hours, and we might ask you to come back and talk more about this, because I know there's issues that we haven't covered, like antibiotics, for instance, is one, and we've just talked about North America specifically, but we could talk about North America broadly, and do some more comparative discussions. But it was an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you for making the time, and for doing all the things that you do to try to make medications affordable for most of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate you giving us a chance to share some of our work.
Yeah, please do. We'll put it up on our website, and make sure you stick it to my alma mater, okay?
I will. I'm going to call you on that. We're going to have some alumni calls for sure.
Okay. Hey, thanks for listening to another episode of UnfairNation. We've got some great guests lined up for you over the coming weeks, but we're going to take a little bit of a break and do a short episode to answer some questions that all of you have sent in. I hope you'll enjoy that episode, and if you'd like me to do more, just tweet me your questions or subscribe to our newsletter on unfairnation.com and drop us a note. As always, thanks for listening and rating and reviewing our podcast. And since you stuck around until the end, here's a little outtake. Enjoy.
Yes, your voice sounds like a radio announcer voice. It sounds very calm and soothing.
Ladies and... Yeah, that's how it's supposed to go. Movie announcer. In a world. Yes,
exactly.
Right.
Yes, in a world.
Right. Okay, good. All right, I should use this voice for my dating profile. Either it'll scare everybody, or it'll work, or it'll scare everybody.
I'm sure it would work well.
Okay, good. Good to have that recommendation.